from the lucid fringe. Ravings from the lucid fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and beauty. Welcome, I'm Semeric Yarrow. This week on Ravings from the Lucid Fringe, more tales from Albion. Expedition to Atlantica, Part 6. Around the fine city, Norfolk and Norwich seen anew. England is a woodland country by nature, even if most of it has been cleared. And one of the things I want to get in touch with more on this trip is indeed the underlying wild nature of the place, where the deer hang out. At least that's what a Norfolk road sign warns or promises. With a car, it turns out this wildness is pretty easy to get to, even further down in the busy south, and in spite of the tarmac that crosses the country to an almost absurd degree. Much of the overpopulation of England has ancient roots, of course. In Norfolk, there are little hamlets of a handful of houses with a big church and 5 roads leading to or from the place, showing that there has been lots of wheel-driven traffic for a very long time. In South Africa, there are far fewer roads, and if you want to get from A to B, there's usually only the current road or perhaps an older winding one as an alternative. Here, I have very little idea what road I'm going on or which village I'm heading towards half the time. So let me put the gear in reverse and take us back a little, to where we are still in the rain and arriving by train after a couple of changes, in Norwich, once randomly called a fine city by a writer nobody remembers called George Borrow, and featured on all the entry points to the city in a rather passive-aggressive way. That's the county town of Norfolk, my birthplace, whose geography I honestly can't remember that well anymore, which is a bit disconcerting. Not much of it can be seen for a while anyway, as it is really bucketing down by now. But the Romanesque Norman cathedral is still visible as we drive past, sticking out behind Poole's Ferry, the old flint bridge house by the River Wensum. Zoria has little time to explore, but we do walk along the riverside together in the rain, past swans, the most exciting and most visible wildlife in these parts. Enormous river ostriches, and they're fairly chilled out as we pass, in spite of the cygnets nearby. Later, in Ireland, I will hear of swimmers getting viciously attacked by other ones, which is also my memory from encountering some at night on a canal path years ago. There are kayaks, too, for heading downriver on less torrential downpour days. Norfolk is quite famous for its wide open broads, mostly east of Norwich, shallow, man-made lakes that were dug in medieval times and upon which flattish boats called wherries used to ply their trade. A Norfolk émigré presumably was involved in road names in Muizenberg, as I have friends who live on Wherry Road. Parallel to it is Cromer Road, which recalls the biggest little seaside town on the North Norfolk coast. And then there are river barges and houseboats. We saw a little of this in Normandy, and now it's super obvious. Wet countries like northern France and the British Isles means many more reliable and navigable rivers than we have in South Africa, so inland boats will become a thing to really notice. Even on my final night of my voyage, where I head to London but close to a canal, there's plenty of narrow boats to be seen, as well as the often somewhat rebellious types who live on them. If you can't quite escape the law of the land, at least the law of the water is a little more of its own kind of thing. Our first evening in Norwich, my father took Zoria and me out into the Norfolk countryside, which is a little like Normandy, but with a lot more hedges and tree-lined places. Normandy had dramatic granite cuttings. Here, there's empty country roads. Norfolk, you see, is not in the south of England. It's a fair way out of the maelstrom that is London, sucking everything of economic value into its orbit. We have an evening experience in a village pub, with a craft beer and a bag of crisps, In my 20s, real ale was one of the things I missed about English life. I've moved on, I think, from days when I had such priorities, and South Africa's microbreweries have subsequently produced beer of far better quality than used to be available. But if England lacks the same level of regional culinary pride as other Atlantican places, it does have good ale. The Fat Cat, a short cycle ride from my father's house, won the Real Ale Pub of the Year award pretty much every year since records began, and the range on offer is dramatic, comparable to, say, the range of tapas on offer at a top Madrid bar. These days there are also good imported beers from craft breweries across Europe. The snacks are a lot more limited than in Madrid, though. This evening there's a smart modern British family with a baby, although generally kids are only welcome in the beer gardens, and there's a big sign up saying drug offenders will be prosecuted. The imagination boggles, as this doesn't seem like the heart of Class A land. Alcohol seems to remain very much the drug of choice round these parts, where vaping too is more than a minor sport. There seem to be vaping shops everywhere in England. And tobacco is generally frowned upon, the smoky pubs of our youth long gone. I feel an instinctive resistance to these electronic puffs, even without all the damage to health evidence being in. It's so obviously a commercial trap. Although the rain returns the next day, we do explore the city a little, and duck first into an antiques market that used to be a church. Norwich has 30 medieval flint churches, a record for a northern European city, though the context is that Norfolk, the surrounding county, has 650 of them. They dominate the flattish skyline, dating back to the days when the wool trade with Flanders was a great source of income, when this region was the most populous in all England, and when Amsterdam was perhaps as easy to reach as London. All the fen marshland to the west had yet to be drained. They're built with flint facing because there's no big rocks in East Anglia. Flint is as big as it gets. There's flint cobbles on the streets of Elm Hill, Norwich's most iconic medieval street, with its timber frame houses. Joanna later points out they mostly have vertical exposed beams rather than the common diagonal ones in many European cities. And we both note the way some flint buildings are planed perfectly, others are left rough, still others are left with whole round cobbles as the facing. There's in fact a wide range of possibilities that people have chosen. It all goes back to the Stone Age, quite literally, when Grimes Graves to the south of Norwich, which I've still never visited, was an ancient flint mine. Norfolk's traditional motto is "Do different," which perhaps informs the way these buildings manage to be interesting and also not uniform. The density of the churches in the city centre is a little ridiculous. Some are completely closed up private property. Others are antiques centres, or a counselling service, or part-time coffee shops, or the big music venue for the city, or a puppet theatre, or fine art galleries and performing arts spaces, and one has a sign outside showing it's applying to be a nightclub. A few are even active churches, though one statistic thrown at me is that modern Norwich is ironically the least church-going city in England. A friend points out the curved flint corners that were designed back in the Middle Ages to prevent late-night peeing by splashing back at the offender. I venture into St Giles, who was given his name to a large section of streets in the city centre, and is indeed an active church. You have to really search to find any evidence of who the saint actually was, though. With the Anglican Reformation, most of the traditional saints were virtually erased. Giles was a Frenchman who talked to a deer in a very Francis-like manner, but you won't find much about that in the church. Somebody has made a nice flagstone remembering him outside, though. Norwich's cultural heritage is gradually being put more obviously on display. And its cultural present, perhaps. I always remember Upper St Giles having interesting restaurants, and these days it's artisan Parisian-style pâtisserie partout. I have an attempt at a new old English artisan thing, a kind of crumble slice, which is a little too crumbly to work properly, but kudos to the bakers for trying, I guess. The old pubs, like the Mischief Tavern or the Murderer's Arms, right next door to the Gardener's Arms, which surely holds some mystery, are generally thriving in this city. I've read about the way rural English pubs in particular have suffered in recent years, and later, in a smaller town in the south, I can see that the only remaining pub is a Wetherspoons chain affair. Norwich still has the capacity to hold plenty of drinkers, although early in the week it seems the closing times are very random, often earlier than might be expected, and definitely up to the publicans, a change from the old 11 p.m. every night except Sunday that used to be a national feature. Down in Colgate we enter St George's, which is about to have a friendly coffee morning for the local congregation, and has leaflets to explore all the Georgian history of that part of town, near the old shoe factories. The old blue plaques, showing where the great and good lived, have been upgraded with fascinating titbits. Here's one saying that a skeleton was found here dating back to the 11th century with Romany gypsy DNA. That's a couple of hundred years before the gypsies are supposed to have been in England, proving that written sources aren't always the most reliable. Archaeology and related disciplines are a much contested field, but they're coming up with new ideas that rewrite what Europe is and was, especially in a place as historically framed as this city. I cycle up London Street, where the historical plaque says, "This was the first modern pedestrianised street in the UK, dating all the way back to 1967. I rather like this freeing up of the historical space. This notion of history, as in the period of time from which there are stories that have been written down, is such a recent part of the human journey, actually. It's still overly dominant in Europe, and often seems to clog up the possibility of finding the presence in the green. But at least let's make it a rich source of story. We venture into other churches, more than I would have done in my youth, perhaps. There's one where the custodian gives us a fabulous 15-minute tour in a broad Norfolk accent, the drawling local sound that drops lots of consonants. There are items in here from plenty of time periods, not surprisingly. St Peter Mancroft, next to the big open-air marketplace, and the biggest parish church in the city, has bell-ringing classes up in its impressive tower. Not the last time we will hear about these, so maybe they're making a comeback. Bell ringers at one point were a bit notorious for practising and then going to the pub. In this particular church, however, a complete 7-bell peal was carried out for the first time 300 years ago. That's a rather mathematical musical phenomenon. It required 5,040 rings per bell in different sequences, taking 3.5 very physical hours to complete. Indeed, after this it was worked out that should be the standard to aim at, because an 8-bell complete peal would last more than a day without a break. In the Normandy church near where we stayed, there's an electronic sequence that goes off these days because it sounds nice and the church doesn't really operate. We will hear some real pealers in action down in Tavistock in Devon some days later. It's one really classy thing about Christendom, and like the Islamic call to prayer, it recognises the power of music, which I have to give 2 thumbs up for. In St Peter Mancroft there's also a rather random-looking cube artwork in the middle of the church. There's a kiddies section for making masks, and there's a special chapel for the earth, which is a rather nice idea and reminds me a little of Our Lady of Guadalupe, except that it's accompanied by earnest English award notices. These days, sections of English churchyards often seem to be being left to go wild, as the quest for recovering the wild continues, and even though mowing lawns is a quintessentially English tradition. After the apparently effortless grandeur of the ongoing Spanish Christian tradition, the impression I get here is that English Christianity really is trying very hard. The market itself is thriving and largely insists on cash, which I heartily approve of. Heirloom purple tomatoes are one of our little purchases. We move on, though, from the market to get coffee in one of many places that are bustling and independent. One cafe offers the most ridiculously huge melted cheese covered and filled toasties I've ever seen. The temptation to overeat seems a little worryingly omnipresent throughout this culture that could be described as English and seeking comfort food. Here are some variations on the traditional Bakewell tart theme that show again the new quest for culinary originality we saw near St Giles. Pasties with not just Cornish meat but intriguing mixes of vegetables and curry, which of course is so ubiquitous these days as to be almost the English national dish. An exciting sounding raspberry croissant, except that turns out to be just a croissant with the jam already smeared in. Oh well. Rhubarb and custard ice cream, giving an English edge that is a little more sophisticated than the traditional chocolate, vanilla or strawberry. For those who don't know, rhubarb is kind of a sweet celery type thing that you bake and crumble most often. Terribly English. That is one of the offerings up at the seaside in Sheringham, where we head out on a trip on an afternoon when the sun actually comes out, as do somewhat awkward-looking English beach bodies. Sheringham Beach is mostly big pebbles, miniature flints, and the tide is high. Fun for some water sports, but not much for just dipping. The town is busy, there's an active theatre offering more than tired summer pier entertainment, and there's a model railway shop. These things seem to be following us. Joanna's father and her son have made some classic models in his Normandy loft. These include trains from the old LMS, London Midlands Scotland Company, and the LNER, London and North East Railway, from long before I was born, the age of steam, which it seems there's still an attachment to. Indeed, the steam train from Sheringham to Holt is about to depart, and the fireman is sweating up in the engine. It's far from the only historical reconstruction moment of this trip, but is one of the most exciting for small boys. That antiques church I first popped into with Zoria has plenty of old model train items, along with tin soldiers that need painting and long-forgotten games. The European collection habit is here in full effect. There's obviously so much stuff in Europe that you could fill a lifetime without needing to buy anything new anymore. The number of charity clothes shops is also pretty massive. In Spain there was now a whole new second-hand fashion chain, a welcome riposte to the ghastly habit of fast fashion, besides the combination of charity and vintage stores. West Runton, next door to Sheringham, at the edge of some lovely woodland walking, is more the classic brown sand I remember. Fossils and flints are in full presence, but the sea itself is gentle and easy to swim in today, and probably not much good for surfing, which isn't such a thing off the long Norfolk coastline. Further still is Cromer, and the cliffs around Overstrand that are falling into the sea a piece at a time. One rather nice-looking cottage, with its front garden perilously close to the crumbling cliff edge, was for sale. Perhaps affordable, but difficult to insure. The north coast in general is full of little treasures and relatively empty of people. We walk past a croquet lawn, and a hotel that once hosted Churchill and other politicians on a regular basis, and down a thin path between brambles and the sea. The German owner of the place was blacklisted as war broke out, very ironically, since he was in fact Jewish, and it's never regained its former status, perhaps a little like post-war Musenberg until recently. Holt, further west, is clearly doing better than ever, though. It's where the smart set seem to be escaping to, and the pubs and restaurants and cafes and, yes, charity shops are worth a nose around, to use a very English expression. The bus from Holt takes an awfully long time back to Norwich, via the attractive little town of Aylsham, which I don't think I've ever actually been to. It apparently has a Christmas market that sounds like it could be the equal of many of the more famous ones in France or Germany. Back in Norwich, there are late buses these days, and electronic signs telling you when the next one is due, just like in the capital cities we've been in. I take Joanna's son to the movies in one of Norwich's new mall areas, and it's a different experience to South Africa. The tickets are way more expensive, the chairs are larger, the popcorn much bigger and more sugary. perhaps a clue as to how those chair sizes got so big, and the adverts way longer. We in fact ask ourselves whether we should stay for the actual movie. It takes so long to get through tedious ads for very obvious brands that already surround us. Perhaps it's because the movies are one of the last remaining captive audiences for adverts. South Africans have an obesity problem that is similar to the UK, with the issue particularly acute in our poorer urban areas, where cheap fast food has often replaced the nutritious produce from the land that is otherwise rather abundantly available. Apparently, the UK has 3 times as much obesity as France. Some questions to ponder, though we enjoy the big screen show, even with the usual Hollywood cheat of giving the Vikings Scottish accents. We can ponder these questions better, perhaps, while circling the labyrinth in the large cloisters of the cornstone-faced cathedral, or in the peace of the cathedral close beyond. There are free, friendly, if perhaps a little over-enthusiastic tours of the cathedral, though I might just be a little guarded against English varieties of earnestness. It is indeed a fabulous example of Norman Romanesque, more than Gothic, though it's had plenty of upgrades in that later style too, and has roof bosses telling a huge range of stories, including that Green Man, who's been reminding us to step away from the history and the fantasy and into the reality of the woods for a very long time. The fabulous Mayan cross I'd seen in Mexico, which has led to so much syncretism between Catholicism and indigenous belief there, is echoed actually in the Green Man, a mystical Christian reminder that the cross of Jesus is part of the vegetable kingdom, spirals within spirals. The 5 oil-painting panels of the Dispenser Retable remain impressively medieval here too, remarkably so, as the big historical thing about English Christian art is the wanton destruction of the Reformation, under fanatics like Oliver Cromwell looking to remove images. In San Marlo we'd seen post-bombing reconstruction, but across England and Ireland it's a case of seeing what could be salvaged after decades of deliberate attack on church property. Not that everything smelled of roses in the medieval English church. Take the fascinating story of William. William of Norwich was a murdered boy whose name was promoted for martyrdom so that Norwich could get its own local saint to accompany its economic might. It was also the first recorded instance in history of the blood libel, the fabrication of a story blaming Jews for ritually killing a Christian child to whip up antagonism against them, and leading in the same century to the first English pogroms. Higher authorities were not, it has to be said, taken in, and William never became a saint, though he still appears in artwork in a few local churches. So in the end, perhaps the best place to ponder things might rather be the much smaller church of the Lady Julian. We don't know her real name, actually, as she was an anonymous anchorite, voluntarily in her cell in the church of St. Julian. It turns out this particular church was mostly destroyed during the Blitz, and was rebuilt by parishioners after the war, which you couldn't tell from the loving reconstruction. And she spent her time not in front of movies, but inquiring deeply into spirit. And her most famous message of all, written down in her popular book of meditations during a time when life was undoubtedly pretty nasty and brutish, was, "All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." It's still a lovely place to breathe out. Albion and Erin. English layers before Celtic landings. There's definitely a soft spot in my heart for Norwich and its hinterland. There seems a lively creativity there, pretty much seen throughout the city, because of the large fiberglass wild animals all over the place. I've seen these in the Cape too, but they seem to be a permanent feature in Norwich, hundreds of them. Some painted psychedelically, like the one outside what used to be the cheesiest nightclub in the city in the 80s. some painted with stars and symbols and all kinds of enticing colours. It definitely brings a groovy modern touch to the country, which I've been assured by the English and international media is generally past its sell-by date in a country losing its soul. Of course, England is familiar to me and all of us in recent years through the soft power of media images, series, movies, even pop stars. Perhaps not on a level of the US, and certainly filtered additionally through the US Hollywood perception of what England is supposed to be and isn't. In Norwich, we'll see Paddington Bear eating a marmalade sandwich outside the cathedral, where he's at least as much of an attraction as the building. In the station he got his name from, he's everywhere. A very weird moment of fiction becomes reality, which I'm sure many religious tales share without quite admitting it. I see marauding hordes of knights and infantry preparing for battle while I'm on the bus one morning. Medieval reconstructions are a popular adult pastime in England, the grown-up version of the fun times for kids we saw advertised all over in Normandy. In Norwich, one cafe we passed was given over to the apparently booming craze for new board and card games. I approve of this new outlet for creativity, though I don't really understand it much beyond the basic Catan set I have back in the Cape. Game design for real-world in-person games is most certainly a thing here in today's England. One game that seems to be getting great reviews is called Azul, and is all about the tiles or azulejos I saw all over the place in Portugal and southern Spain. Of course, I can see the appeal of making games beautiful. It all seems very distant from the crass capitalism of monopoly. Later I even pop in, on a friend's recommendation, to a local board games convention. There are games that are focused on a cooperative end, games rewarding green behaviour, and even ones that allow you to veer between cooperation and competition depending how you feel about the people you're with. I remember playing Risk decades ago and seeing my imperialist bastard come out, and I guess that was therapeutic in its way, possibly. Or possibly just a way to argue with friends. These games seem generally more appealing, interesting, varied. There's a lot of complex thought that's gone into creating them. Definitely one of those newly refined rabbit holes I could hang around in if I had more time on my hands. Meanwhile, live-action role-playing games also seem to be back in fashion in England. Possibly they never went away, though I wasn't following them for ages. Perhaps not too far from those historical reenactments, and while they're particularly popular with the more fantasy-oriented modern goth types, just like they were in the 80s, that's by no means the only market. This gets us back to that real-life collecting craze I saw in the antiques shop churches in Norwich. I guess there's a tension here between, on the one hand, the physicality of old toys and games, or their new smart designed versions, and on the other hand, the video game screen fantasies that many end up getting lost in our electronic age. One imaginative little girl I meet uses the Roblox game to grow things in her own creative world style, and is a little irritated by its online nature. It means people playing by the rules can come and buy her stuff that she doesn't actually want to sell. I'm impressed by her resistance to capitalism. Layers of story, of history. And as I've shared before now, much of where I would experience this was away from Norfolk and the east and instead down south. We spent time in Exmouth in Devon, at a hotel with enormous ceilings from an epoch of opulence that seems to have passed. The grass is looking dry, and the exciting revamped menu doesn't quite have everything available that it claims. We're warned off spending too long on the terrace because the seagulls are apparently vicious, which seems slightly comical. Seagull baboons? At night on the weekend there is someone racing round on a motorbike late and at speed, like boys do down the M5 in Cape Town, in souped-up cars with mag wheels. However, on a sunny day, this is still the warmest spot in England and fun to hang out in for a while. There's a beach that's also in a broad estuary, so that there's all kinds of plant forms to get through for a swim that I've not come across before. Teens are hanging out in groups. We saw them coming down on the local metro train from Exeter, a reminder of summer in Musenberg. There are people digging holes in the beach. This is apparently a wholly English phenomenon, the Europeans in the party observe. Once upon a lifetime ago, as a smallish boy, I was nearly buried alive digging one of these a little too ambitiously. We skim stones, a more universal pastime. We take a family boat trip at one point up the estuary and further along the Exe. The most exciting thing the announcer has to share with us at one point is the kind of train going past. It's not the age of steam, but categories of mechanical things still have some attraction that largely escapes me. The on-board waiter says he'll be with us, just now. A little shared joke, as he's South African. Another part of me remembers chips with curry sauce and mushy peas, which we got last night on a family walk, talking with Joanna's northern cousins. It's all pleasantly borderless at this point. Somewhere on the other side of the channel from here is Normandy, where I'd tried a bowl full of moule. Not my normal kind of food, even after all that Spanish seafood. In Exmouth, we instead eat a great curry, while the English women's soccer team beats the Spanish to the delight of those at the next table. Then we walk through the streets, past the terraced houses with bay windows. English builders were big on these, and eking out of a slightly more middle-class space. Terraced houses with the original traumatised response, I think, to suddenly having to house so many more working-class people than had ever existed in one small country before. The rest of Europe seems to have come to the party later, and generally with smaller blocks or more apartments. And a lot more lifts. I think the first lift I ever used was on a childhood holiday in France. People leave their curtains wide open, which seems almost indecent, being able to stare into the intimacy of their lounges across the tiny front gardens. In Exmouth there are bigger buildings up on the hill which look exactly like faulty towers, set close by in Torquay. Pastel colours. Later I will walk on Bournemouth Beach at sunset, further east in Dorset, where there are beach huts like in Musenberg, but also in these subdued pastels, the Laura Ashley version of a resort perhaps. In the Bournemouth Park there's a brass band, live and enthusiastic. Summer life goes on. Unimaginative soccer players apparently live near here in mass-produced mansions, because it's the thing to do. One sweet thing to see in England is those old red phone boxes and the red pill boxes that still, amazingly, take and deliver letters rather rapidly. Many of them are additionally wearing crocheted hats these days, featuring different scenes. Memorably in Exmouth, one of the crocheted scenes we saw was of sailors, with a speaker hidden somewhere that blasted out a sea shanty from time to time. But the most remarkable one I saw was in Avebury in the heart of Wiltshire. A crocheted image of Pachamama, the green Mother Earth goddess. As in Glastonbury, perhaps a little bit of Mexico filtering through the collective consciousness. And in the centre of the most remarkable stone circle in England, perhaps in the British Isles. It's enormous, so big it's got a village in the middle, and a number of roads driving through portions of it. My archaeologist friend Matt points out where bits have been chipped off by locals over the centuries, even as it's been put back into place as far as possible. He says they found a skeleton here when the rocks were being restored. A late medieval fanatic trying to destroy the devil's work, who got his karmic comeuppance when the massive sarsen stone fell on him. Like at Merivale in Dartmoor, there's a long corridor here, a processional route perhaps. Matt is as impressed, if not more, by the earthworks around the circle. It's a colossal site, and nearby is Silbury Hill. Except it's not a hill, it's a vast chalk pyramid, the biggest in Europe. When I was at Teotihuacan in Mexico, I saw workers removing the new plant growth from the Pyramid of the Sun. Here, that's not happened, and so it's been allowed to remain as reconquered by the local vegetation. But imagine it without, and perhaps without the pouring rain today, and it is an incredible piece of work, definitely related to those who built Avebury, and the West Kennet Barrow Temple that's also nearby, and Stonehenge up the road. We actually stopped in Avebury a little longer, exploring an old dovecote, seeing an unused puppet show opportunity that's out for bored kids to play with, and having lunch in the Tudor pub that sits incongruously in the middle of the magic. It has a ghost in its well, apparently, dating back to the horrors of the English Civil War. Outside in the village there are sloes ripening. Like the blackberries, they're early this year. Still a little sour, but Matt knows them well by trial and error. He's explored the old English fruits and berries and experimented to the extent of creating elderflower wine that over-fermented and exploded in his garden. Besides moments of ancient history and mystery, this was a week of reconnecting with everyday life and friends in the south of England. That in itself was wonderful, enriching. Moments of reconnecting with my peers as well as meeting children who hadn't come into this earthly plane last time I was here, riding in cars they get lifts in to schools and camps. My friend Karoon has retrained into artistic upholstery and shows me her certifying armchair deep buttoning project, rediscovering the artistry in crafting. I'm glad it's happening, given the amount of tech coding everywhere too. Conversations with friends put all those missing pieces from the recent decades into, well, a story form that makes us a little more human from touching sides like this. Warmth, connection, a little more love stretching across the continents. Over a mocha knot at one point, an extreme pastry that shows the artisan squared nature of modern baked one-upmanship. The reconnection with old friends is heartwarming. I do have concerns about this fourth Atlantican country, however. Aside from the dubious excitement of the motorways, that curious modern English over-concern with avoiding risk seems irritatingly in our faces, or at least in our ears, from the beginning. The last time I was here, 16 years ago, there were discussions of the need to teach business students about risk-taking, so absent was it from childhood. Things don't seem to have improved since then, perhaps in a subconscious revolt against those marauding, risk-taking imperialists that gave this island a bad name worldwide. There are polite announcements on the trains telling us joyfully that we may be prosecuted for not having the right ticket, in a tone as if this was like winning the lottery, and that we should see it, say it, so it can be sorted, in some glib marketing department's version of a helpful announcement. I've subsequently read a humorous, sarcastic, anachronistic Latin version of this in a 2023 Asterix book that Joanna's son took out of the local library. Vid it! Dix it, fix it. So this bizarre announcement has apparently been around for a while already, and is probably just white noise to most of the English. I hear from old friends that it's become virtually impossible to plan official outings and school exchanges. The safetyism safeguarding has reached a level of bureaucratic restrictiveness that is really affecting the freedom of kids. There are definitely things in England that jar me culturally, though perhaps some of it is just English awkwardness at another pitch to what I remember. It's rather endearing at times, but not always. On another train trip some weeks later, a very loud woman spends 45 minutes, I checked my watch, virtually shouting at her best friend on the phone and revealing personal details I'd rather not have known, oblivious to the unwilling audience. On another carriage, with an overbooked train, a foreign tourist comes to me for help because people have taken his family's seats. The family in question refuse to show their tickets to us, and I'm quite astonished at how other people just join in supporting them, almost tribally to say we should just leave it. The ticket inspector does eventually get through and tell the interlopers they're on the wrong train. We arrive at the station, where there's a classic safetyism sign at the top of a fairly ordinary-looking set of stairs down to the platform. Warning! High-risk accident zone! A bunch of these excessive reminders about things that should be blindingly obvious eventually have my South African daughter questioning whether the English are in fact a little bit stupid, Dad? Possibly, but also clearly worried about being sued or something if they don't say such things. I depart the south of England with the patience of a saint. I say this because while I had originally hoped to reach Ireland by boat from the coast of Wales, I actually take the quicker route with my father of a Ryanair flight from Stansted Airport in Essex. On my drive there I pass Stonehenge, which is rather impressive in the sunrise, and also more visible from the A303 than virtually anywhere else, unless you're part of the Druid crowd allowed in for the actual summer solstice these days. The Druid neo-pagan religion has grown rather fast and is about as historically valid as, say, the Mormons. I got to see The Book of Mormon while in Norwich, the outrageous and hilarious musical from the South Park creators, which is ridiculous and hugely ironic and performs about as good a version of the true, dangerous jester poking fun at our various forms of dark power as you could get. It's done in the style of earlier biblical Lloyd Webber musicals, and the style of the many stories that have purported to be truth, but need a distinctly offbeat idea of truth to be swallowed. Hey, if it works for you, I'm not going to jump on anyone's sense of spiritual story that inspires, unless it happens to involve license to rape and pillage the planet, even more than previous stories somehow ended up doing. So, patience. The bus drivers in the south, usually friendly foreigners, are pretty on the ball when I need them. Most taxi drivers likewise seem to be from other places and not minding the greyness too much. But my experience at Stansted Airport was remarkable for being the most offensive, aggressive series of encounters I've ever had in a travel situation. If I hadn't been able to speak English, I would have been really anxious and upset. I was treated a number of times as if I was disturbingly and annoyingly stupid. The occasional bit of humanity on the part of officials seemed to be a breath of unexpected relief. Stansted seems to be a classic example of monolingo land at its worst, actually. Paris had had metro and museum announcements in multiple languages, acknowledging the range of people visiting the world's tourist capital. Spain and Portugal, like France, had multiple languages for key signs and notices. England gives you English, sink or swim. I was expecting the worst on my return to England too, a fortnight later, but luckily then I flew back into a completely different, infinitely friendlier country called the North. And we would arrive now in a different country too, with passport control and everything. The Irish Republic, and Cork Airport in particular. The fifth and final modern sovereign state of Atlantica, and the only one of the many cultural nations I've passed on this trip to have achieved a recognised breakaway from the metropolitan empires, though at enormous historical cost along the way. There are two languages again on the signs, even if almost everyone understands English. They drive on the left. They use kilometres, with a maximum speed of 120 on the largely empty highways. There are compact mountain ranges popping up on the sides of the road to Tralee. I can already see why some of my South African friends might feel quite at home here. They also seem notably more relaxed when we arrived than they were on the ex-imperial side of the British archipelago. It has some similarities to what I remember of Scotland, last visited a quarter century ago, but also plenty of differences. The sing-song brogue is a marker of a softer quality, seen in the gentle slopes of the peaks, which aren't as dramatic as the northern Celtic lands, but are lush and beautiful. There's moss everywhere because it's so very, very damp. The Celtic bit is rather important, of course. That's the culture that has been hinting at us all along the West Atlantic coast of this trip, and here at last has given us the other language on the signs, one I know only a very little of. Its poetry and accents a memory of a different time. Ta bron orm means I'm sorry in Irish, except it literally means sorrow is upon me. One wag said of the English language playwright J.M. Singh that he discovered that if you translated Irish word for word into English, the result was poetry. Ta, in that sentence, ta bron orm, means is, because verbs also come first in Irish sentences. This is far from the only unusual bit of grammar. It really is a very different kind of tongue. Ireland didn't suffer the kind of Dark Age cultural wipeout that happened elsewhere in Western Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, mostly because it had never been part of Rome anyway. There were Irish translations of Greek and Roman texts in the first centuries of its independent forms of Christianity, even as there were in Arabic Spain. Irish learning was revered even by those monks in Britain and Europe that were themselves trying to keep book learning alive. Alongside those were detailed old Irish epics and mythologies that spring up mysteriously all over the place, quite as rich as the better-known Greek or Norse stories. This is truly Western Europe's most venerable indigenous written tradition. I dip into a friend's little book about some of this at one point, but I won't be able to catch up with this fantastical and fantastic landscape in so short a time. And yet, under British rule, it was almost all relentlessly destroyed. Then, in the 1800s, the infamous famine, more of a genocide carried out by horrific negligence, also affected Catholic Irish speakers far more than the English-speaking Protestant ascendancy. By the time of the Irish revival in the 1900s, only around 1% of the population of the country spoke their ancient, highly literary language. Today the figure is a lot higher, but it's still struggling. 2 new Irish friends tell me they learnt it at school. It has been compulsory in the Republic since the beginning, but badly. Lots of lists of vocabulary that they still recognise, but no real sense of how to string it all together. I think we suffer with similar problems in relation to our own indigenous languages in South Africa, often taught poorly according to out-of-date teaching styles. Today in Ireland is a more concerted revival in the cities, with Irish medium schools increasingly popular. Even as it seems to be under-supported in the key areas, mostly in the rural west of the Gaeltachts, where it's supposed to be strongly promoted as a language of choice. In Dingletown I say, Diawit, hello, or literally, God be with you, and Gurama Agat, thank you, or may goodness be at you, to an assistant in a cafe, who, pleased at my attempt, in return says to me, Good lad. My octogenarian father is referred to a few times as a boy in Irish English, because that dialect in turn has its own sweet idiosyncrasies that come through, even in those who don't know much of the old language. Notwithstanding my initial impressions, Ireland is a very different experience to South Africa. 32 ancient counties for a start, each with their own local histories to get lost in, 26 of them in the Republic. There are still loads of ancient roads all over the place leading to who knows where. In fact, quite often there are crossroads with no signposts at all, or signs to places that then are never mentioned again further down the road. The assumption seems often to be that if you're going that way, you know where you're going. And there are lots of little hamlets that one runs into, living quiet little lives nobody much knows about. The Republic is not huge, about the size, in fact, of Mpumalanga, with roughly the same population, so definitely the smallest of the 5 countries I've visited. One friend, who is originally South African but has perhaps been in Ireland a little too long to remember our kinds of distances, complains that her trip from the far western peninsulas to Dublin can take all of 5 hours. County Tipperary, where we'll spend some days, is a little smaller than Norfolk, itself relatively sparsely populated for an English county, but has about a fifth of its population. Ireland's small population is the result of it being depopulated over the last 2 centuries, in a strong contrast to most of the global north. At this point, my detailed knowledge of Irish matters extends mostly to what I learned at school, under the euphemistic topic of the Irish question, which definitely wasn't furthered much by 5 days in Dublin in my 20s. My father's been here, but not often and long ago, so we feel the anticipation. One more foreign land, waiting to be explored. So, thank you for listening to this latest episode in the series, and you can find all of my articles and my recordings at lucidfringe.substack.com, except my music and poetry from the past, which is all available at simrickyarrow.bandcamp.com, and the background recordings and sounds that you will have heard are all either from those recordings or they are my own. Please do give this a rating if it's on your podcast app. Please spread the word if you enjoy what you hear, and if you want to give me some feedback or commentary. Of course, I'm very open to that. Any suggestions for future episodes? Okay, enjoy. See you next time. Ravings from the Lucid Fringe. Ravings from the Lucid Fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line.